Hi there, and welcome. My name is Jeff Bell, and on behalf of McLean Hospital, I'd like to thank you for joining us for yet another episode of our educational webinar series. Today, we set our sights on a topic that impacts everyone: anxiety. We all experience it, and when we do, our first instinct is often defensive. We tell ourselves that we need to push back against anxious feelings, and we do all we can to escape their discomfort. But what if we did the opposite and chose instead to embrace our anxiety? Well, as it turns out, there's plenty of evidence that such a counterintuitive commitment can actually help us thrive. Our guest is someone who knows a lot about anxiety and how it works. Dr. David H. Rosmarin is the director of the Spirituality and Mental Health Program at McLean Hospital and an associate professor of psychology in the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He is also the author of Thriving with Anxiety: 9 Tools to Make Your Anxiety Work for You. David, thanks so much for your time today.
Jeff, thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Well, we're thrilled to have you with us. As I mentioned, you are a leading expert on the topic of anxiety. You are also someone who has found himself challenged by anxiety. Share with us how you initially came to this work and how you have personally learned some of the lessons that now you are imparting to others.
It's funny, as you say, expert, you're actually making me palpably anxious. So I'm feeling it right now, and thanks for bringing me right into it. I've definitely had my own anxiety at several points during my life. I think the most pronounced was at the beginning of the pandemic. I was overseeing a group of practitioners who were treating 500 patients at that time. And we were going into a very uncertain period of history. And there was a huge onus of responsibility on myself and on the clinicians. I didn't know what was going to happen with all these patients, and we had to shift to telehealth in just 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. It was a tremendous ordeal, frankly. And I was terrified what was going to be with all the patients that were under my care. And I had to lean into that process and embrace the possibility that things wouldn't go well. Interestingly, that was not the case. The patients who were being treated actually did surprisingly well if they were getting care before the pandemic. And we even published a paper on this recently, and we found that those individuals surprisingly did not have a bump in anxiety during the pandemic at any point. And what I learned from that experience, it's really changed my perspectives on anxiety in a big way. That the more we lean into it, and if we're prepared for the eventuality that we will experience anxiety, and I think that's the case for all human beings, this can actually help us and in many ways inoculate us against some of the greatest stressors that we might face ever.
Well, I love some of the paradoxical aspects of your work, and we're going to talk about some of the counterintuitive ways that you approach anxiety now. I want to ask you to put the finest point possible on a couple of terms here: stress versus anxiety disorders. Let's start with stress. What's the key distinction between stress and anxiety?
Absolutely. Stress is an imbalance between our resources and our demands. When demands are greater than resources, we experience stress. And those resources could be emotional, they could be time, they could be financial. And the demands could also be any of those domains or something else. Stress is not necessarily a bad thing, and I think it happens to all individuals at some point. It does happen to all individuals, and especially, I would say, high-functioning individuals, because when we are pushing ahead, that depletion, if it's calculated and reasonable enough, can actually help us to expand our resources and to manage greater demands. The problem is obviously when it tips over and those demands become drowning and the resources are severely depleted. That imbalance does have to be something we keep in check. That's very different, though, than anxiety.
And before we talk about anxiety more specifically, you make a reference in your book, and I'm paraphrasing here, but stress can be sort of a canary in the coal mine when it comes to anxiety. Can you explain what you're talking about there?
Yes, that's true. That's on the negative side. So when stress is not a positive factor, but when we are depleted, when there is a gross or a significant, I should say, imbalance between our resources and our demands, well, that can signal that we really need to recalibrate and we need to rebalance. In many ways, when you're dealing with stress, there are only two things you can do. You can lower your demands or increase your resources. And if we don't heed that canary in the coal mine, right, the warning sign, well, that's when physical ailments often tend to manifest. People are like, no, I can handle this, or it's okay, or I don't really need to deal with this, or they don't get the sleep that they need, the exercise, the social support, dealing with the financial issues, trying to reduce our demands. It can get out of hand and actually get quite toxic and even dangerous. So that's what I refer to over there.
Gotcha. And so we've talked about anxiety, we've talked about stress. What about anxiety disorders? What are we getting at with that term? What should we know about that for our conversation today?
Sure. So anxiety disorders are when anxiety becomes unmanageable, really, when it's something that is what we call significantly distressing or impairing. Now, that line has shifted over time. Today, I think people are very sensitive to our anxiety, and we are very distressed, even by low levels of anxiety that are not necessarily causing dysfunction, which unfortunately plays into the anxiety process and speeds up and accelerates our anxiety in a big way. So when we have lower levels of anxiety and we are upset about it, we're distressed by it, that in of itself will release more adrenaline into our system, which will cascade and turn anxiety into a self-perpetuating process. It actually makes it worse. Now, at a certain point, though, it really does cause, of course, it causes significant distress, impairment, and person can't function. And that, I think we do need a little bit of a different approach, a more technical approach to be able to manage.
David, help us with some perspective here. I don't want to put you on the spot with any facts and figures per se, but ballpark, do we have a sense of what portion of the United States population, for example, struggles with anxiety on a regular basis?
Yeah, it's incredible. Today, if the 5 of the next 10 people that you bump into on the street are going to have some sort of significant anxiety. And if it's teenagers, then you're probably looking at 6 or 7 out of 10.
Wow.
These are very high numbers. And notably, prior to COVID, it was more like 20 to 30%. So 1 in 5, 1 in 4 people, which is still high, but it's significantly jumped. And I believe that the core of it's many people at lower levels and mid levels of anxiety and stress have this perception, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And I think we need to challenge that assumption.
Absolutely. And you do a nice job of laying out the reasons for challenging that assumption in your book, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. I want to ask you about the physiology of anxiety. What's going on in our bodies? And let me start with this. We sometimes hear about fight or flight. How does that factor into this conversation?
Sure. Fight, flight, or freeze, as it's called these days. There is a physiological component to anxiety when we fear that something negative is going to happen. And whether that's the feelings themselves or something external to us, our adrenal glands release adrenaline into our system. And that creates an incredible cascade of physiological effects almost immediately in the body. I'm sure these are familiar. The butterflies in the stomach, the difficulty breathing or constricted breathing, increased heart rate, sweating, pupil dilation, which can create a little bit of a dizziness because when our pupils dilate. Now, all of those are actually physiological adaptations and healthy. The reason primarily they happen is our body is increasing oxygenated blood to our system in order to propel us forward so that we can fight or flee or freeze in a way that's going to help and protect us. The problem is when we interpret those symptoms in of themselves as maladaptive or an issue, as opposed to, oh, my body is just reacting in a fairly healthy and normal way to whatever I'm experiencing.
And am I right that anxiety trigger need not be all that real sometimes? An imagined trigger can also set off that same physiological response?
Sure. I mean, I think everybody's had the experience of being surprised or frightened by something and then all of a sudden turning around and saying, oh, that's funny. It happens at the movies, intentionally by directors. Like we'll get startled by something and then the next thing you know, the audience is laughing. So that startle response is built into us and it could be for a very benign, in fact, often it is in our industrialized world for very benign reasons. And that's why we have to be more aware that anxiety in of itself it's part of humanity. It's part of how we're wired, and that's a good thing.
You sometimes reference the anxiety spiral. What are you getting at with that?
Sure. This is the concept I was trying to delineate beforehand. When we start to feel anxious in the industrialized world, typically we interpret that as a failure. Something is wrong with me. I am sick. I am weak. This is a disease. Something is not well. And that perception psychologically feeds adrenaline into our system, which increases our heart rate and our breathing rate and our sweating. And all of those physiological symptoms compound upon one another. And that's what I mean by a spiral, because it starts with a little bit of anxiety. Then there's the interpretation, this isn't right. And from there, the anxiety can spike. I think we are seeing that en masse throughout our society in really an unprecedented way.
You also referenced the cognitive model, and I think it might be helpful for you to kind of walk through the three components of that and why that's so relevant to what we're about to discuss in terms of embracing one's anxiety.
Sure. The cognitive model. Beck and colleagues who really changed the field of psychiatry by understanding that the way that we think about a situation will impact how we feel. If you're going to the grocery store and some bananas fall out of your cart, and you think to yourself, oh, I'm such an idiot, I can't even go grocery shopping. How are you going to feel?
Lousy.
For sure. As opposed to the bananas fall out of your cart and you think, oh, this cart must be broken. It's not going to be as
reaction.
Much better cognitively, and that has an impact on your feelings. So the second person, with that second level of cognition, it's not going to, there's not a sense of I'm broken, something's wrong with me. And when we think about whether it's bananas or anxiety or anything else for that matter, that something is wrong and I am broken and this shouldn't be happening, that thought in of itself actually propagates different feelings inside of us. And that's the essence of the cognitive model.
I want to ask you about what we might call the default relationship with anxiety that most of us have. You mentioned sort of that reflexive response of self-judgment, for example. I think a lot of us try to run from anxiety. We try to avoid situations that will create anxiety. Not a healthy approach?
Definitely not. And I'll harp on one word you said, which is default. From a human perspective, that is not the default. If you look at the majority of the planet, if you look at low-income countries, middle-income countries, the levels of anxiety it's incredible. It's half or even a quarter of what it is in the industrialized world. I think this is the default in our society, that we have been conditioned to think, I shouldn't be anxious, I shouldn't be stressed, this shouldn't be happening to me. In the rest of the world, it's understood that if you're stressed, if you're anxious, if you're having a very difficult time, well, that's a product of the adversity that people are experiencing. One of my close colleagues here stated, if you're in a war-torn country and there are missiles flying and things are, going bananas and you don't have anxiety, that's an indication that something is wrong. In the world that we live in, which is largely safe, of course, there are issues and safety and otherwise that we have to deal with. But largely, by and large, if you live in a safe society, driving on cantilevered surfaces with running water and electricity and the other accoutrements of the modern age, then the feelings that we have actually become an enemy, as opposed to just recognizing this is how we're wired as a species.
So given that, and that's such an important distinction you've made there, given the way that we sort of instinctively in the US, for example, react to anxiety, what are some of the other ways that we typically play that out? I mean, we avoid situations that might trigger us, for example. What else do we do when we're not actually mindfully approaching anxiety?
Well, I think a lot of the issues start really with children and parents and the society that we live in, which seeks to protect. Now, we don't want children, adolescents, young adults, especially, to experience high stress, high anxiety. We seek to protect individuals from these feelings. And it's coming from a good place. It's coming from a place of compassion. But I think what has ended up occurring is really stripping, in many ways, a generation of the opportunities to build resilience and the opportunity to have greater a greater sense that we can, and in many ways are designed to overcome these struggles emotionally and external to who we are. I mean, human beings are incredibly resilient, and that doesn't get enough space or talk, I think, between parents and kids, in the school system, in industry, and really in society as a whole. Never mind the clinical element of it, but I think these are missing themes.
So let's get to the paradox here that essentially what you're saying is rather than run from that anxiety, turn the tables, embrace the anxiety. Why?
Well, this is where it gets complicated. Can we be brave, do things that make us feel uncomfortable, and move ourselves forward to become more resilient and more capable of withstanding these emotions? And the reason why I say it's tricky, the reason why it's hard is because it's not fun. It means having sweaty palms. It means having a pit of in your stomach. It means walking around feeling a little bit short of breath. But from dealing with successful people, clinically and non-clinically, I can't think of too many people who are really pushing it in terms of their careers, in terms of their life in general, who aren't experiencing those levels of anxiety on a regular basis. And they interpreted that as a normal response in the context of pushing the limits in their life. That's a very different frame, though, than what I think most people take today.
Absolutely. Acceptance, it seems like that's a big part of this equation as well in
Definitely.
terms of embracing and accepting. What do you want us to know about the role of acceptance in this process?
Most of all, self compassion. It is not a failing when people feel anxious. It is not a failing to have a pit in one's stomach, to have your heartbeats going. I'll be personal here. I mentioned before my own anxiety. One of the hardest parts at the beginning of the pandemic was this thought, like, hey, I'm, supposed to be an expert in mental health. Here I am, uh, actually feeling palpably anxious myself, like waking up in the night, having sweats, feeling a pit in my stomach, having difficulty eating even at some points, just because I was really stressed out and having a hard time. And then at a certain point, it clicked. I'm like, David, you're human. And this is stressful. This is a lot of responsibility. And if you didn't feel anxious, something would be wrong here. And once that clicked, and I saw what happened to the patients in our study, it really changed my relationship with this feeling that we all experience. Let's face that.
I have to ask you about a parallel that I'm seeing unfold here.
Sure.
I am somebody who has lived with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, for much of my life, and I've been through some terrific therapy for that. I'm seeing some parallels with exposure therapy and the whole concept of sitting with your anxiety. Can you talk about that connection?
Definitely exposure therapy, and you'll know this viscerally in your gut more than I ever will. It isn't just about sitting with the anxiety, it's about confronting it intentionally,
Yeah.
right? Putting yourself in situations, it's about running towards your anxiety. And, I might even call it transcending your anxiety, where you're really saying, even though this is going to hurt, this is going to suck, I'm going to do this anyway. It's definitely, firstly, I have a whole chapter in my book about exposure therapy, but the way I've been thinking about it and presenting it to audiences is as follows. If we work out in the gym and we're lifting weights and we're doing vigorous cardiovascular exercise, it hurts, it burns, it's uncomfortable, right? I do distance running. If I do a long run, if it's 10 miles, there's going to be a point that I want to give up, that I want to peel back, that I feel like I can't keep going. And pushing through that is what builds resilience. I think that's the best analogy I have. But to the emotional side, the issue is in our society, we haven't encouraged people to face their fears en masse. We usually do it only in a treatment setting. I think that's I think that's not positioning ourselves for optimal emotional health.
What do we know about the neurobiology behind exposure therapy, for example? I mean, I've seen some really cool brain imaging pictures that sort of suggest that, our anxiety will in fact dissipate if we allow it to.
So this is a very, very important topic. The There's an area in the brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is receives blood flow in conjunction with the amygdala. The amygdala is a neighboring body right next to the hippocampus. And when people feel anxious, blood flows to the amygdala and also to the adjacent hippocampus. Why am I mentioning the hippocampus? It's responsible, among other things, for encoding memories in the brain. So when a person has a high emotional experience, a high valence, whether that's a positive one or a negative one, we're more likely to remember the details of that moment. I'll give you, a classic example. People used to say, this was before my time, but where were they when John F. Kennedy was assassinated?
Sure.
Yeah. A more recent example would be, where were you on the date of September 11th? Here's another one. What were the colors if a person's married and there were flowers there? What were the colors at the wedding? These are usually the things that people remember because our emotions are involved in those moments. And when blood flows to the amygdala because of those emotions, the neighboring hippocampus encodes those memories into our cortex and they remain with us. The reason I'm telling you this, exposure therapy involves the emotions. People remember their exposures.
Sure.
I'm sure you remember your exposures.
I do, in fact. Yeah.
Why do you remember those so much better than a random day on a random Wednesday in whatever year it was?
I would say because the emotions were so heightened because
Correct.
of the anxiety.
Right. So when people go through exposure therapy, what you're really doing is crystallizing new memories into your mind. Those become new pathways that help us to assimilate, oh, I can go through this. I can survive it. The anxiety won't kill me. It's uncomfortable, but that is going to make me stronger. And this is something I want to do. And all of those messages actually take on a neurobiological place, to my understanding.
Wow, that's fascinating. We have so much ground to cover, David. One of our goals with this webinar series is to weave in as many audience questions as we can.
Great.
And you're getting a lot of questions coming in. So let me tackle a couple that are sort of on topic for us right now as we're talking about physiology. Can you discuss the physiological symptoms of functional freeze and what that might look and feel like?
Functional freeze. I would say in some ways, all aspects of anxiety are functional in some context. Freezing is one symptom of anxiety. And when people do freeze, then that can signal. I mean, we often see it in sexual trauma. And one of the reasons it makes it decreases it signals to a perpetrator that this is not going to be as good of an experience. And that can decrease the purpose is decreasing the risk. So in many ways, even in that context, which is pretty extreme, it's a functional process that people are going through. In many ways, I see all the symptoms of anxiety similarly. There's a reason why our bodies are doing this. There's not something inherently wrong. It might be a maladaptive process in that it's happening too much or too severely, but in of itself, there's nothing, it is functional.
Here's a question from a parent, David. Does talking about our anxiety make us more anxious or less, or does it depend? More anxious or less, or does it depend? As a parent, on one hand, I want to help my kids process anxiety mindfully by talking about it. But on the other hand, when is dwelling on it and talking about anxiety detrimental?
Great question. That is a fantastic question. Talking about anxiety in of itself can be helpful as long as the resolution of the conversation is it's normal that we feel this way, and we are going to accept it and continue to move through it, continue to move past it. If the resolution of the conversation is, oh, and therefore we need to avoid it, or we're afraid of this, or there's something wrong here, that can reinforce and to the questioner's point, be detrimental.
That makes perfect sense to me. You are somebody who studies spirituality and mental health. That's certainly part of your expertise. And in your book, you talk a little bit about some of the spiritual gems or gifts, if you will, of anxiety. And I really liked what you talked about with one specific example about what we sometimes call hit and run OCD, or a scrupulosity factor, where we're concerned that we as human beings need to control everything. Can you explain far better than I just did how that all ties together?
Sure. Spirituality, firstly, I'll just give a preamble here. Spirituality is any way of connecting with that which is sacred or greater than the physical universe. So something metaphysical. And for many people, that has a religious tone, but for many people, it does not. An increasing number of people, in fact, it does not have specific religious overtones. One of the aspects that really cuts across different spiritual and religious traditions is letting go, that humans are not always in control. In fact, we're often not in control. I would even say we are seldom in control. And often we don't even know what is really happening. And we don't have as much knowledge or as much control over life that we think we do on a regular basis.
We
Letting
sure like to
go,
think we do, don't we?
we like to think it. And it's in some ways that's protective, but in other ways, I think, especially in our society today, it's become maladaptive and we think we should have control. And then when things go wrong, then it's our fault. As opposed to, you know what? I'm just human. This is my space. Beyond that, it isn't. And having that humility to be able to recognize that and accept it, I think anxiety can teach us that. And when it does, that can be a catalyst to not only emotional and strength and resilience, but I think spiritual striving.
Another great question that came in. Many people will say you need to calm down. Could you give us some ideas of more helpful things to say than calm down?
Yeah, calm down. That'll usually make somebody more anxious because you're actually signaling to them, rather, something is wrong and you must calm down, right? So that's going to fire more adrenaline into the system. Even a small tweak is, let's calm down. Putting an arm on the person, giving them a hug, playing music, just to settle things down a little bit. When people are jazzed up with high levels of anxiety, I mentioned before the amygdala, the blood is flowing to the midbrain and really away from the cortex. People aren't able to engage in a linear thought process. So they might need a temperature change. They might need to go for a walk, an environmental change, a hot cup of tea, a temperature change. Like I said, a hug before, or listening to music. This is just to sort of soothe in the moment, as opposed to, you need to do this. That's a cognitive process, which also signals to the person something's wrong. I mean, that I agree with you. That's not the way to go. So those are a couple ideas off the top.
David, you made a great case for why we should embrace our anxiety. Let's talk a little bit about the how.
Great.
I know you've got some very specific strategies. Let's take a few minutes and walk through some of those if we can.
Sure. Top strategy: do something that makes you uncomfortable at least once a week. Now, don't do a 10 out of 10. Okay. At least not without a therapist or support. Not even a 9 or an 8 out of 10. Those could be maybe nevers and maybe once or twice a year. But I think if we're doing something in the 4 or 5 range on a weekly basis, and we know this is going to suck, this is going to hurt, this is going to be uncomfortable, and I want to do it anyway to build my resilience, I think it's just a good practice. It's humbling. It's strengthening. It's getting us used to the reality that negative emotions, are part of life. So that's one strategy.
How about the second one?
Great. Confidant. Have a confidant, somebody who you can speak to really from the heart about how you feel, to pour your heart out to that person, to cry with them, to be vulnerable, to show them that you're struggling, and find somebody who will accept you, who will, put their arm around you, proverbially or physically, and to understand, somebody who can understand and really love unconditionally who you are, irrespective of how you feel. This is a human need that we all have. When we use anxiety in this way, it actually increases our connection to that person and to others. There are risks here. Not everybody is a good confidant. Not everybody understands. And there are, we have to build those relationships. They don't just happen. Many people today are isolated and alone and don't have those connections. But doing what we can to forge those connections is a process. But if we have them, I think we should be using them.
David, for folks who have a faith-based framework, what would you suggest that they do to incorporate that in this acceptance of anxiety, acceptance of uncertainty?
Yeah, even without a faith-based framework, I think what we were talking about before, having the humility to understand and to recognize this is beyond my control, and that's okay. All of us have these electronic appendages these days.
Yeah.
And it's incredible how much control we seem to have over the world. We can send out a signal and it gets received instantaneously around the world. And we can have back and forth with people. You can build a Fortune 500 company from your basement these days with a little device, right? That costs $1,000 from Apple. Really, and people do this. It's incredible how much influence we can have. At the same time, that hasn't taken away in an iota from our limited knowledge, our limited control, our limited time on earth. So many other factors, sickness, disease. I mean, there's so many things that just we don't have control over. And remembering that, I don't think it has to be faith-based. I think this is just part of humanity.
Another specific question that came in. Do you have suggestions for college students dealing with anxiety attending school out of state or far away from home, for example?
Yes, I do.
Let's hear
them. College students need to understand primarily that they will feel uncomfortable and anxious. You're in a dorm, you're surrounded by people. You leave the dorm, you're surrounded by people. In many ways, you're never alone. And that can create such a sense of loneliness because you always have to be on. Plus, there's school. Plus, you're away from home. The food often not great. Sleep, typically disturbed, to put it mildly. Add in that, exposure to, sexual violence on campus, incredible. There's so many things that are happening in college campuses today that if somebody isn't anxious and stressed, that makes me worried. What's really going on? So I think primarily, you used the word acceptance before, and I think that's where it's at. If people are expecting to feel so great on college, the delta between that and the reality is it's going to leave them in shambles. We're seeing that.
Question came in from a viewer who wants to know when someone is experiencing a panic attack and they are having a hard time breathing, what would you recommend that someone do to help that person?
Great. Firstly, I want to mention that this is already leading into the clinical realm.
Yep.
So without giving specific advice, because I don't know who asked this question, the typical answer to this question, which might change depending on a couple of unique circumstances, is to lean into those feelings. When we accept this panic is here, it's going to last however long. By the way, it's usually less than 10 minutes, which feels like an eternity. And it feels like death, but it will not kill you. I've never lost a patient to panic, and I never will. It's not deadly. But when we lean into it and we say, okay, bring it on, however long it's going to be here, I'm just going to allow it to occur. I'm just going to feel it in my gut, in my stomach, in my lungs, wherever it is, with the sweating and the discomfort, not fighting it. When we fight it, we actually increasing our adrenaline, which feeds it and perpetuates it and makes it worse. And when we accept it, that starts a physiological process of actually letting it just go. And it does eventually resolve.
Another question from a parent. Should a parent try to expose a child to her own worries and anxiety?
Great question. Exposure therapy only works when it is voluntary. If you force somebody to face their fears, not only are they not really going to be facing their fears, they're going to hate you. So don't, what I might encourage parents to do is to say, do you want to do this with me? It will build resilience. It's going to be hard. Let's try to do this. You can validate that it's going to be hard. You can also reinforce, hey, great job. I did this. Did you do that? Getting the person to buy in, even a child, There has to be that I want to do this and why. And that's really where the magic of exposure therapy is, when we voluntarily and intentionally confront our emotions, not when it's involuntary. That's traumatic.
We're getting some great questions coming in. Let me share this one with
Awesome.
you. How can you make the connection of embracing the anxiety and recognizing the anxiety can be a normal response in the moment? I hear what you're saying, but in the middle of an anxiety spiral, as you say, it is so hard to focus on embracing it and not running from it.
Yes, it absolutely is. And this is what I was mentioning beforehand, that this is really the art of doing clinical work and trying to help people to figure out which practical steps they need in order to get things to a low enough level that they can metabolize and inculcate this perspective into their day to day. If it's hard to do, that is exactly what therapy is for. And that's what we're here for.
And I guess it sort of begs the question, how do we know when it's time to involve a professional? I mean, I realize that there's not one answer to that question,
Yes.
but can you give us some guideposts?
Sure. When we are getting stuck and feel that we can't accept our anxiety, that we can't use it in a constructive way, that we don't know what to do, we don't have the skills, or we know what they are, but we're getting stuck in implementing them, that's where therapy comes in. And I'll mention, it's not therapy or reading a book. It's not reading a book or speaking to a friend. It's not speaking to a friend or going for a walk. All of those are in a continuum. And there's things on the other side of the continuum as well. All of it, to me, are different ways of managing our emotions. And we can pick and choose and utilize any number of those at any point in time. And I think many people today are using different things, but I don't think we have to get stuck in like, I need this or I need that. It's really utilizing what we need at any point.
Next question. Can you talk about anxiety that appears to have no prompting event when it comes on so strongly out of seemingly nowhere?
Sure. There always is some sort of a prompting event. Sometimes it's very subtle. And often when people feel that it's out of the blue, it actually arises within the person. So if we call it panic, when a person starts to feel anxious and uncomfortable, and then they think something is wrong with my body, and that creates more anxiety. So the prompt or the cue, the trigger isn't external. It's not like there's a car accident, or it's not like they're low on money. It's actually something inside of the person. There could be other things that the person's just not aware of that is a stressor from the outside. They're not talking about it. They've moved it out of their conscious mind. They're not aware of it right in the moment, but sometimes that can happen as well. So it could be an external trigger that the person's just not thinking about, but more often than not, in these cases, the out of the blue is something, the actual physiology of it.
Another great question coming in. How does substance use play into coping or overcoming anxiety?
Great question. Substance abuse, or substance misuse, I should say, often results from anxiety. When people feel anxious, right? Especially I'll add even so, especially social anxiety, right? A person's in a social setting, they're feeling uncomfortable. Well, get your liquor courage, right? That's what's said today, unfortunately, and it does. There's physiological reasons for it: flooding GABA into the system, tamping down our anxiety, giving us more courage, really, to be able to face these situations. The problem, obviously, is that can be addictive. There's the euphoria of using substances, plus there's the negatively reinforced effect of reducing our anxiety. So it's very, very sticky. It's a high risk, especially for females. I'll add, statistically, with anxiety, have a very high risk for substance and alcohol misuse, and it's something we need to be pretty cautious of.
David, we tend to have a lot of clinicians in our audience for this webinar series, and I'd like to ask you to speak directly to them. What do you want them to know about treating anxiety?
So the clinicians are seeing clinical levels of anxiety, which are significantly not only distressing, but impairing, dysfunctional, creating maladaptive patterns. I think a lot of the tools of thriving with anxiety and learning to turn it into a strength apply to a broader audience, and perhaps a little bit less so to the clinical manifestation of it. Like once somebody's already coming in for therapy, pharmacology, services, typically their anxiety is, significantly more, and there's a need to be more scaffolded and clinical in one's approach to dealing with it. With that said, I do think that the overarching theme of accepting our anxiety, not fighting it, understanding that it's a normal process, leaning into it, confronting it, understanding the physiology of it, explaining that to patients, all of that, I think, has a lot of value. So it's just a little bit more nuanced in how that's actually plays out with a patient or
Let
client.
me ask you what might come off as more of an esoterical question, but
Okay.
big picture, we talked about society and how we are not doing ourselves any favors, for example, in the United States, when it comes to embracing uncertainty and embracing anxiety. What might we do differently at a societal level in our education systems, government support systems, whatever those might look like? How might we better shape the discussion around anxiety?
Okay, so this is really the space that I'm trying to move into and understand, like, why is this happening at a societal level, and how can our education and larger systems really reshape our relationship with anxiety to understand that this is something which is human and maybe even adaptive when we use it in the right way. I mean, I'll give you an example of where things are going wrong in my view and off the rails. I mean, last summer there was a federally funded panel of uh, physicians who advised all primary care physicians across the United States to screen for anxiety during annual care visits. Okay, not a problem. It's good to know whether your patients have anxiety or not. The problem was that they set the bar for flagging patients for treatment and for diagnosis and treatment at a 0. So only individuals who report 0 anxiety and 0 worry in the last 2 weeks are not flagged. There's a very high false positive rate, as you can imagine, especially for time crunched primary care physicians in now assessing, diagnosing, and even treating anxiety. And my concern is that when we set the bar so low, we actually convey that any level of anxiety is a medical problem, is a disorder. That is not true. And furthermore, it's maladaptive because we are conveying that what we are doing is creating a cascade. Now people are reacting to the fact that they are feeling low levels of anxiety with more anxiety. So it's propagating a vicious cycle. And we need to reset that balance and understand that if we have on a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, even a 4 or a 5 of anxiety, that could be very adaptive and helpful depending on what's going on. On a regular day, if it's a 1 or a 2 or a 3, I don't see that as maladaptive or a problem. And I think we need to really reframe this for our society as a whole, well, within our institutions.
The discussion itself around this, is it increasing over the years? Is the trend line moving in the right direction?
The trend line is definitely moving in the wrong direction. Our levels of anxiety, the prevalence of anxiety has shot up by leaps and bounds. And I believe, again, the primary reason for that is because we expect never to feel anxious or stressed, which is just not realistic.
Let me ask you a very specific question again. As a parent who notices my teen's social anxiety is triggered and heightened when exposed to social media, do you have any tips on how to help your child recognize that they need sporadic breaks from social media?
Oh, social media and teens. My heart goes out to you. I've got a couple myself, and it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. I'm sure you've seen Jonathan Haidt's new work on this. Very compelling, very sobering, very scary. Um, I'll add really one point here. The parent who asked this question seems to feel solely responsible for this. If you were a parent during the 1950s, 1960s, and your kid was smoking, and you felt as responsible as you do now for your kid's social media use, what would you go back now and tell yourself? You would understand that tobacco companies had responsibility for the way in which tobacco was marketed, available to kids, and understand that that was part of the culture that they got caught up in. And the same thing's happening today. I do think there are things that parents can do, don't get me wrong, but there's an overinflated sense of responsibility that it's on us as opposed to looking at the system, that's the context in which it's occurring. This is one of the biggest businesses in the world today, in social media and really entertainment, electronic entertainment. And these are, I would say, casualties of a much larger context. It's way bigger than us.
Question came in about intrusive thoughts, which we sometimes hear in the discussion about OCD, for example. What should we know about intrusive thoughts and how they factor into our conversation today about broader anxiety?
Yeah, one of my favorite statistics about intrusive thoughts is how common they are. Intrusive thoughts are upsetting thoughts, often about morality. They could be about violence. It could be about sexual matters. It could be about anything that are upsetting. They come back to us. Now, the data I remember seeing in the social psychology data for years has shown that more than 90% of people in the general population have some intrusive thoughts. One of the ways that OCD develops, in fact, is when people become allergic in many ways to those intrusive thoughts. They get upset about them. That actually increases the emotional valence, the emotional salience of those thoughts, which, to what we were speaking about before, increases blood flow to the amygdala and the hippocampus. When they're having the thoughts, it's actually encoded more in the brain, as opposed to learning to let go and say, like, oh, that was a weird thought. Let's just move on. So it's very analogous to what I've been saying about anxiety, although a little more specific.
In a related question, David, we've talked about exposure therapy and the parallels there. A viewer wants to have you speak a little bit to cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and I imagine the whole notion of recognizing distorted thinking, for example.
Sure. So cognitive behavior therapy, just to clarify, is not one technique. It's a series, and I would say an evolving series set of techniques, of therapeutic psychotherapeutic ways to help individuals overcome emotional distress, behavioral dysfunction, and the like. Now, we've been speaking about exposure therapy, which indeed is a behavior aspect of CBT, because the person is behaviorally confronting, doing something and moving towards it. With regards to the C, this cognitive behavior, the cognitive aspect of cognitive therapy. This is related to Aaron Beck, who we spoke about beforehand. We're trying to shape a person's thinking about it. We've been speaking about this today, Jeff, which is when people interpret their anxiety in their mind as this is part of who I am as a human, that reinterpretation of the anxiety itself changes our feelings. It changes our relationship with the anxiety, and also just it takes things down a huge notch. So I am a big fan of CBT in general, and I think we've really spoken a bit about both aspects.
What about this notion of catastrophic thinking, going for the very worst? I know you touch on that in your book as well.
Sure. Catastrophizing. Yeah. When I am anxious, it means something's wrong with me. It means that I'm broken. It means I'm not going to be able to handle this. It means that the anxiety will last forever. It means it's going to kill me. People are going to notice, right? People with social anxiety often think, oh, people are going to notice how I feel. They don't notice. Almost always people don't notice. I myself, as a trained clinician, have had patients panicking in the office right next to me, and I didn't even pick up on it. It's a pretty common thing, in fact. I don't think it's because I'm oblivious. These catastrophic thoughts obviously lead into the anxiety, and it's something we have to be aware of.
I have a couple questions for you as somebody who has been doing a lot of talking recently about anxiety with the public, with the media, with folks out there. What have you found to be a common thread when it comes to people sharing their own experiences with you about their anxiety? Just generally speaking, what stands out to you as a common thread for these conversations that you're having?
I'll tell you, it's been pretty amazing and so sobering. Almost every media interview that I've done, and whether it's for national television, whether it's on high-end podcasts, or whether it's just run-of-the-mill anything for newspapers, any journalist almost every conversation that I have with someone in across these industries gets personal at some point. And the person I'm speaking to talks about their own anxiety, their family's own anxiety, what they can do, and how important it is to reframe this as a part of humanity and something that is potentially a positive if we learn how to use it in the right way.
What about the research you did for this book, David? What surprised you? What did you learn in doing this work?
Thanks for taking me back to the research because I mentioned initially about that study we did about patients who went through treatment before the pandemic. That was the most shocking thing to me. When people are prepared for anxiety and we accept this will happen, these are the skills that I need. I'm going to put them into place. I mean, we found in our study over 750 patients in that study collected over the course of an entire year. And what we found clearly was when people have those skills and they're implementing them, they are inoculated even in once a century level stress. It was a pretty striking finding about the power of cognitive behavior therapy in dealing with symptoms.
What's next for the research? What do you want to delve into more deeply around this?
Jeff, you're making me anxious thinking about the future. I don't know. I don't know where this is going to go. I think public education is really critically important. I think we need to be having more of these conversations with larger audiences. I think there is a critical need to not only provide better treatments, but to reframe what anxiety is to the general public. And as a clinician, I love helping individuals at high levels of distress, but I also think consulting to education, consulting to industry, being able to move beyond that. And I've been very blessed to be able to do some of that work here at McLean as a forward-thinking institution. We right now are collaborating with a large insurer on how to provide insurance company and how to provide education resources to staff members in industry. And I think that's really where I would like to go. But we shall see.
We shall see. Embracing that uncertainty. David, you touched right there on education, and I just want to spend a minute here asking you about what you would like to see done at, say, the K-12 level in terms of dealing with anxiety. Are there things that the educational system can be doing to better prepare young individuals to deal with anxiety throughout their life?
Definitely. There are definitely things we can do. There's reading, there's writing, there's arithmetic, there's history, and there's also emotional resilience and building that. I think there should be curriculums. I think they should be developed. I think they should be integrated with activities, not just a cognitive process and memorizing. The exam, I'd love to see the exam do something that's uncomfortable. That would be a great final exam. For at whatever level through K through 12. And more importantly, I think in colleges, I would love to see colleges having required courses in how to do this. Not with multiple choice exams at the end, but something actually meaningful that helps people to transform their relationship with their emotional and their behavioral health, not just to educate, but to actually change. We have the capacity to do that. And I think that's in many ways the next step for the field.
It dawns on me that we should probably touch on the progression of this skill, if you will, because I imagine it's not just a linear improvement. I imagine we take a couple steps forward and a step back along the way in terms of, gosh, I'm dealing better with anxiety. I'm employing these techniques that David shared in terms of embracing the anxiety. We don't do this without taking a few backward steps along the way, do we?
Great question. If you feel the progression, you are probably not facing your anxiety because it's not going to feel good. Right? The more we face our struggles, the more we accept our stress, the more we lean into the panic, the more anxious you will feel, the more your palms are going to sweat. So if you think that if the linear track in your mind involves, oh, and I will feel better tomorrow, like that is exactly the opposite. If you're feeling better, then I'm wondering, what did we do wrong? Almost always in exposure therapy, patients feel a lot worse before they start to feel better. And I think we do need to course correct as a society. It's kind of like training. If you start training for a 5K race, the first couple of weeks are going to be, they're going to really suck. But that's part of the training process. If that's what gets us going, then I guess it's linear.
Can you share a success story? I mean, anecdotally from your research, anything that you'd like to share in terms of a positive message about why you believe that this does work?
Yeah, so many, so many. Something happened this week. Something happened this week. It's escaping what happened this week, but I'll tell you a story. I mean, one of my kids was afraid of ants. And I said, okay, I know enough as a clinician not to be involved clinically. So I called up one of my friends. I said, hey, I got one of my kids is very afraid of ants and very upset about it. So brought him in. He spoke to my kid, and did exactly what I would have done, but which is help him to face the fear of ants. Um, uh, you know, the I kid you not, he's learned like, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable. They're gross. I don't like them. They're crawling on me. It feels uncomfortable. But to actually face forward and to be able to embrace that as opposed to recoiling away from it. And it's just not an issue today. But more than the ants, this child of mine has learned to face adversity in other areas of his life. Mm. So it's not only about the phobia, it's not only about the difficulty. That anxiety, by leaning into it, actually created a a strength of character, I would say, to be resilient and to be able to do other things that are hard, whether that's doing a rock climbing wall or learning to shoot 3-pointers or, learning to play the drums or whatever it is. That's all part of now the personality. And I think that's in many ways emblematic of taking this anxiety and turning it into a strength. When we have the right skills and tools, this can actually be a catalyst to growth.
That's a great place to wrap things up here. I do want to ask you real quickly about favorite resources that you might want to pass along. Obviously, you've written a book about this. Are there other books out there that you recommend, websites, videos? Where do you like to point people for learning more about all this?
Yeah, I mentioned Jonathan Haidt's book on anxiety beforehand. I think it's a must read, especially for parents of young children. There are Dr. Luana Marcus at MGH wrote a great book called Bold Move, and very similar in terms of overall thinking to me, but she has a different structure for presenting it, and she's a wonderful colleague. There are a number of great resources that are being available on this, and of course the McLean Hospital website, which I'm sure you can tell us about.
Absolutely. Always a great resource. David, this hour has flown by. We're out of time. I just want to thank you again for being our guest today. This is such an important topic, and you really helped us understand it in some powerful, counterintuitive ways. Really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. David H. Ross-Marin. And to those of you watching, thank you for your interest in our educational webinar series. We hope you'll come back for our future sessions, and we wish you a wonderful day.